Good evening, everyone, and a really, really warm welcome. Thank you so much for coming out on a cold evening. We're getting a bit more nervous about COVID again and so on. It's just marvellous to see you. Thank you for coming. If you don't usually come to Eden, perhaps it's your very first time, we're so glad you're here as our guest, and we really hope you enjoy this evening. And I'm delighted to introduce to you, well, many of you will know her already, but introduce to you Dr. Amy Donovan. Amy's been a member of Eden for a very long time and is a lecturer in the Geography Department at Cambridge University and a Fellow of Girton College. And just so pleased that you've joined us this evening for this interview. I put together this title about volcanoes, natural disasters, environmental disasters, and climate change. Just throwing all sorts of things together, but it's because Amy, in her professional and vocational work, tries to bring a Christian mind to what she does, and what she does includes all of those things. And we're wanting not just to think about those things themselves, interesting and valuable though they are, but what it looks like when a Christian mind goes to work on the subject. So do keep coming in, you guys, don't worry. Just come in and find seats, that's absolutely fine. Amy, I want to dive straight in and say, volcanoes.
Yeah.
What's your favourite one?
I don't actually have a favourite volcano.
Okay.
And yeah, I sort of love them all, really.
Okay.
But they all have very different characteristics, very different behaviours, and from the sort of the chemistry side to the challenges that they pose for local governments and communities. So it's a very different task to work on lots of different volcanoes because they're all very diverse, and they change through time as well, so they can have small eruptions and then there can be a much bigger eruption at the same volcano, so there's lots of variation, and yeah, it keeps volcanologists on their toes.
Yes, I'm sure it does. Have you got some pictures? Can we like pictures?
I have got pictures.
Oh, great. Can we turn the spots down a bit and we can look at some pictures? Excellent.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about some of these pictures, what's going on, and why you're drawn to it. What makes you so drawn to them?
So this is an eruption in Iceland this is in 2014, in sort of early September, when a fissure had just opened up just north of Vatnajökull ice cap. And it's come from Balthabonga volcano, but it's Hullerhraun where it erupted, the site where it erupted. And it sort of started off with a sort of smaller fissure, and then a second one opened up. And I was there with some colleagues from the Icelandic Met Office, helping them to monitor some of the gas emissions from the fissure. And that eruption went on for about 6 months and produced a very large lava field. And it was really the largest Icelandic eruption in terms of the volume of lava since the 1873 eruption of Laki. The sulfur dioxide was huge from this eruption, so that was detected as far sort of south as places like Ireland. And in the Laki eruption in 1783, there was a very substantial gas emission that caused significant climate impacts across the northern hemisphere and into the southern hemisphere, we found out recently as well. So Icelandic eruptions can be quite significant in that respect.
So how did you get into all of this? Because when I first met you, you were first year, you were reading English literature, which is my subject, which is fantastic. And I think you did a master's as well. I mean, how did you get from novels and poems to volcanoes?
So I was always interested in geology. I had a sort of a book of the outdoors when I was a kid that I was really fascinated by the volcanoes in that, and by the planets as well. But I became very interested in literature at school. I had some really lousy geography teachers at school as well, which didn't help. And I read English because I really loved it and I was good at it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I still love it. And then I did a master's in medieval literature. Not the obvious way into volcanology, but it's possible. So, and then I did start a PhD in medieval lit. But I was increasingly lost in terms of what I was doing. And I started doing Open University geology on the side to have something interesting to do. And I thought, and that if you reach that point in a PhD, that's a sign. So I stopped doing the PhD, and I was working at the same time. I was trying to earn some money from editing, and kept doing some Open University for a few years, and then did a master's in geophysical hazards at UCL, and then a PhD in geography in Cambridge, looking across the sort of science and society interface. So looking both at sort of physical volcanology, but also doing quite a lot of work on policy and how science is made useful in advising policymakers and working with communities.
I think that research centred in a particular place. Is that right, in the Caribbean?
Yeah, so that was Montserrat in the Caribbean.
What were some of the things that your research uncovered?
Montserrat is a fascinating place, a wonderful, wonderful place with wonderful people. And as an island, it's still very much special to me. They went through a really horrendous experience. Montserrat is a UK overseas territory, so it's governed by the UK. The Foreign Office appoints a governor, and then they have a locally elected government, but it doesn't have a lot of power. And the eruption essentially sent it flying backwards developmentally, in terms of economic development particularly. It was very nearly economically independent before the eruption started. It was a place where like the Beatles went to do their recordings, and there's actually a recent Netflix film all about air studios on Montserrat, which I recommend. That's George Martin's studios where they did all these recordings. So Montserrat was flourishing, and then this eruption happened, and decimated the capital city. There are some photos of that somewhere on the PowerPoint that we have.
Let's keep flicking through. Joe's Amy keeps talking. Yeah.
And Montserrat also is a very Christian culture, so it's very. Most Montserratians go to church on a Sunday. Most Montserratians are part of one of the churches on the island. So one of the things I did in 2011 was to interview some of the church leaders, some of the people who went to church on Montserrat, and ask them about the experiences of the eruption, which was fascinating and very inspiring in lots of ways, because they'd been through losing everything that they had. They'd been through a lot of their friends moving off the island and not seeing them again. They'd gone through this kind of complete reconfiguration of all of their social networks and everything else. A lot of the churches had been turned into shelters because there weren't any other places. So all of a sudden they were all living with each other in a church building. And if you kind of imagine everybody at Eden trying to live in this building for any length of time, you'll understand some of what that...
Yeah, that'd be a good research experiment and topic, wouldn't it?
I think the pandemic's been difficult. Yeah, it's... and so they talked about how difficult that had been, but they also talked about how it had brought them together and taught them what was important. They talked about the privilege of seeing new land being created, because that's ultimately what volcanoes are doing. They sustain life, so we wouldn't be able to live if we didn't have volcanoes. They balance out the atmospheric composition in a way that means that it's warm enough on the planet to live. Unfortunately, we've now taken that too far with our own activities. But
I mean, that's kind of new to me, and maybe to others. So they have a balancing function that is essential to life. Okay.
Yes, they do. In the production of carbon dioxide over very long timescales. And the Montserratians were very clear. You know, they'd had a privilege of seeing creation happening before their eyes in terms of... And they shared with me a lot of the Bible verses that had helped them in the really difficult times, particularly from the Psalms around God being a refuge and a place to hide, but also some of the parts of the scriptures that talk about the creation of land and sustaining of life on the planet and so on, and some of the ways that they had learned what was actually really important in life was not material possessions, that you couldn't cling to material possessions because those could be taken away very easily. And so that teaches you that it's horizontal and vertical relationships, it's relationships with each other and with God that are important in life, and not the material things that we so often chase after, I suppose. And that was very humbling as well, to hear that from people who'd been through so much. And
that draws me on to ask a kind of more abstract question, really, about the Christian mind, and for you, what it means to have a Christian mind as you think both about physical geography in terms of volcanoes and other kinds of the kinds of environmental disasters that you look at, but also human geography, policy geography, those sorts of things. What for you is a Christian mind doing in that kind of optic in your academic work?
I think there's a lot of different elements to it, and I suppose where I come to this from is partly from being in medieval literature and thinking, why am I doing this? What good could it possibly do? And realizing through some of that actually that exploring that sort of text is a way of understanding the human mind better, the history of the human mind, how things have evolved, how people have engaged with the world that they were living in back in the Middle Ages, and what that teaches us about ourselves and what it teaches us about God, and trying to sort of work out what the purpose of studying that, because I still believe very strongly there is a purpose in studying all of these kinds of things. I don't think that there is a hierarchy of, the STEM subjects up here and the humanities down here, which is how it often gets presented. They are doing different things, and I think through some of the work and the sermons at Eden in the early 2000s, when you were working on maximum life and other things, around how to serve God in every aspect of your life. I suppose I was sort of thinking around how do you serve God when you're just in a book every day? What are you doing that's actually worthwhile in that? And some of that is you're growing yourself, and that's valuable to God because he wants you to grow. Some of it is the interactions that you have with students or with others, other academics. Some of it is in the sort of wider impact that your work might have on somebody, not necessarily even in a policy sense necessarily, but in sort of making them think slightly differently, because we do have very active, curious, inquiring brains that God has given us for a reason. And he wants us to understand ourselves better, to understand the world better. And in the work I do currently, I do at least sort of think around like policy issues quite a lot. I work quite a lot with communities and with policymakers. And I think there are lots of different ways. There's honesty and integrity, which is really important in academia, especially I think at the moment. It's very difficult in some corners of academia. There's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of competition. And then I suppose there's working, who you choose to work with as well, and how you choose to work with them, where those people are and whether they have the same resources as you do and the same privileges as you do, which in the field that I work in is very important, because you are often working with communities and academics in countries where there are just far, far fewer resources. And so that there's always a power dynamic there as well.
Okay. So being a Christian gives you an awareness of that power dynamic, and a sensitivity to it, a sympathy for the person who's on the wrong side of it? Is that how it works?
And I think a lot of it is about compassion, and love, actually.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that I see sort of loving your neighbour as a very, very broad thing. Yes. I think you can do that through writing scholarly literature on, medieval history or whatever it is, and you can show it through working with communities in very practical ways as well.
Yes.
And it's about, I suppose, it's the trying to orientate yourself so that you are focusing on that motivation above all of the other things that are tugging on you, which I do not always manage at all.
Does intellectual curiosity have a place within a Christian mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you trace that biblically?
So the creativity that we gain from being made in the image of God, I think, is really important. And that creativity, and I think one of the things we have to be very mindful of is that all of these things are tainted by the fall as well, that our creativity is not perfect and it is marred by the fall. But we also have to have a responsibility to use it in ways that are positive, and that try to help people and to help each other, and to help life on Earth in general, I think.
Okay. You've written a couple of very good Cambridge papers, and we've got copies of these for people to take away at the back. I want to ask you about, I think, the more recent one, which is about environmental disasters. Yeah. Now, sometimes people will say, oh, there's an earthquake, and lots of people die, and that just shows how cruel God is. I think you've suggested that your research, and the research of people who are not even Christians actually, suggests it's not quite as simple as that. Can you help with that?
Yeah, so in the disaster research literature for the last 40 years really has been arguing very strongly that there's effectively no such thing as a natural disaster. And there is a social media campaign called No Natural Disasters that's been going for a number of years. Okay. And at the UN level, that's been widely accepted since the 90s, that all of the social research demonstrates very clearly that the impact of a natural hazard event is either amplified or attenuated by the social circumstances of the people that are affected by it. So it is the poorest people that suffer the most in disasters. It's the rich have ways of mitigating and managing. These days we have, thanks to our creativity, we have a lot of technology that can help us to anticipate disasters, that can help us to prepare, to assess things like urban planning and so on, and do that in a risk-sensitive way. But we choose not to. It is a choice often. It's often a choice that the global north can make and the global south cannot make. Anthropogenic climate change is amplifying both the frequency and intensity of environmental disasters as well. So that's a whole other anthropogenic level to it. But even without that, even with volcanoes, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes, where the hazards are pretty much completely independent of humans, the populations that are worst affected are always the poorest people, because the land on the volcano is cheap, so people can afford to live there. And we saw this in the 2018 eruptions of Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, which is obviously one of the richest countries in the world. The people who were worst affected by that were the people in Puna, which was the poorest part of the big island, because the land is really cheap and they could afford to live there. So a substantial proportion of them were living below the poverty line in Hawaii. Land in Hawaii is generally very expensive. So if you're somebody who's come into work, you're working fairly menial jobs in the hotels, for example, you might live you'd have to live somewhere that's cheap to live. There were other people who had chosen to live there, and they were happy to take that risk. But often it is the poorest people that are the worst affected, and that is much, much greater a problem in the global south, where there is less central government support, less capacity to get people out. People don't have cars. They might not have infrastructure. They might not have functional roads. They might be living in an informal settlement that's not recognised by the government, for example, because they can't afford to live anywhere else. And all of those areas are massively vulnerable. And so the focus in the social research around disasters for the last 40 years really has been around understanding vulnerability to disasters and how we can reduce vulnerability. And a lot of that is around sort of improving socioeconomic conditions, working with different cultures, being sensitive to different cultures, and trying to combat corruption in politics, which is a huge problem as well. That's across, the whole world, not just the developing world.
If that idea is new to you, that an earthquake that kills 100,000 people doesn't just in a simple way indicate that God is cruel or unthinking. Amy's paper is a good way to start with that. There's lots of footnotes to take you further if you want. For me, I think it's a very important point for Christians who are trying to talk to people who are not Christians. Maybe if you're not a Christian, part of your understanding of who God is could be impacted by that. But I want to draw you on to the subject of climate change. Forgive me if this sounds too basic, but there may be someone here who's asking this. Is climate change happening, and is it driven by human behaviour?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
So the climate, over geological time, the climate has varied on much bigger scales than it is currently varying. So 65 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, there were no ice caps. also meant that the rats were the size of cats and so on. So, you know,
We've had rats at home, and I don't want the ones the size of cats. Yeah, gosh.
And there were dinosaurs as well, but everything was bigger. So the climate system has accommodated more carbon dioxide and so on. The problem at the moment is that it is happening too quickly for anything to adapt. Over the geological timescales, species adapt. But on the current, 150 years, the amount of climate change that has happened is unprecedented across all that we know of the geological history of the Earth. And we cannot adapt to it, and neither can other species. It's killing off other species. It's causing huge problems in the developing world, particularly in terms of the increased intensity and frequency of disasters. And we know that this is anthropogenic because we can measure. We've been measuring. So
anthropogenic means?
Means caused by humans, essentially.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupt you. We know it because we can measure?
We measure the CO2 in the atmosphere. We know what's coming. We can calculate it on the basis of what's coming out of industrial emissions. We now know how much the volcanoes are producing, which we didn't know until the last sort of 5-10 years. And that they're not even touching what humans are producing. There is, in the scientific community, there is effectively no doubt that it is anthropogenic. And obviously there are other processes within the climate system that cause variation, some of which are more on the natural side, but are being influenced by the anthropogenic. It's not like it's a black and white kind of a picture in that sense. But in terms of are we causing catastrophic levels of climate change? Yes, we are.
Okay. What does a Christian mind have on that? Can you bring a Christian mind onto it?
I think, for me, and obviously I'm kind of biased because I work in the disasters community, I see it through the way that this is affecting populations now in countries that are badly affected by extreme events. The incidence of super typhoons, for example, the huge cyclones that have been hitting places like Mozambique in recent years, sea level rise in the South Pacific Islands, particularly the loss of habitat and the fact that some of those islands just may not survive. So there is that side of it, and having compassion, and not just compassion actually, but also the responsibility that we have to other humans to ensure that our behaviour doesn't make life worse, in some cases even worse for them. I do also think, though, that there's a very strong sense, just looking at Scripture and what Scripture says about the creation, that humans are part of creation and humans have a particular responsibility to creation. And that's very clear right from the start of Genesis. It talks about us having some sort of role as benign kings, or I think the word is related to kingship. Yeah. And in the Bible, kingship is a servant kingship. It's a way of sort of looking after the subjects of your kingship and your dominion, if you'd go for the old translations of Genesis, but I don't think that's a massively helpful word. And that means we have a responsibility to care for the earth and to use the knowledge and the creativity that God's given us to make sure that we're living sustainably. And a lot of the language around agriculture and treatment of other species in the Old Testament is very much sustainable. It has to be sustainable. You have the Jubilee year, and you have all of the kinds of looking after the ox and stuff as well. There's lots of sort of the general sense of all of those passages points towards sustainability, which is something that we are just not doing. We have a form of capitalism at the moment that is just extractive and exploitative of the creation, and I think that is fundamentally wrong, and there is no biblical justification for it.
What's been in the news recently is the COP gathering. I mean, can you give us your own personal assessment of that and what it achieved, and whether you 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10? I mean, maybe not, but just what your feeling best is.
So the COP, and I will try, in case anybody has been asleep for the last 2 months. The COP is the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And this is the 26th COP26. And it's when the signatories to that treaty come together to discuss progress and so on and make pledges and all of the rest of it. It's also surrounded by a lot of activities for scientists. I was involved in some of that. I didn't go up to the COP, but I've been heavily involved in various discussions around it, and particularly as part of the disasters research community. But the trouble with the COP and with a lot of international processes, policy processes, is well, there's two main things. One is that the change is glacial to, well, even some glaciers move faster than... you have to get agreement on every bit of text. Every word has to be agreed between all of the 100 and whatever it is countries. And so what you tend to see is what gets referred to as UN speak, which essentially says very little and changes very slowly. So we got fossil fuels into the text for the first time in 30 years this year. And if you sort of think that catastrophic climate change, all of the catastrophic tipping points that the recent IPCC report has been talking about happen in a lot less than 30 years' time, the fact that it's taken 30 years to get an acknowledgement that fossil fuels might be an issue into the COP is a sign that the international policy process doesn't really work. Having said that, there were positive that's a positive step. There were positive bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements on the side of the COP, and in some ways those are where the interesting things are happening. The agreements between groups of countries. So there was one that was publicised was around deforestation, for example, reducing deforestation and phasing that out and things. So there are signs of progress. The other big problem with these big international policy processes is that they have very little in the way of teeth. And so there's not a lot that can really be done to enforce them. And that, again, is a problem because it just means that, as the US was doing under Trump, countries can just renege on the promises that they've made. And that will happen on a political timescale, which is very short, but still can be quite extreme in its sort of impacts and in the kind of ongoing drag that it produces on the entire process. So I think there were encouraging signs in some corners of the COP, but the problem really is that the process itself is far too slow. And that is worrying, I suppose, from
Are you pessimistic?
I oscillate between thinking there are good signs, I think increasingly that the way that change is going to happen is through grassroots movements and political movements and activism, and more people just standing up to governments and voting on the basis of green agenda. Because I think that's how change has to happen, really, is partly through the electoral system, which in this country is dysfunctional, but we'll not go into that.
Not getting too political.
But also through often through grassroots projects and things like that, through raising awareness, things like the school strikes. I personally found extremely encouraging because that shows a generation that really is motivated to try to change things. So that there's, I get some days I feel positive about that, and some days I think yes, but the people in power are still lethargic. So it's mixed.
I want to draw on to another area. We were talking about this at our house group supper the other night. I think it's easy for someone for a very tender conscience who's fully persuaded of the problem and is getting bombarded constantly with messages about personal behaviour to end up in more or less permanent guilt trips. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important discussion that there's no perfectly right answer to, but the individual choices can make small differences. It helps to recycle. It helps to eat less meat, for example, but individual lifestyle changes are not going to solve the problem. The problems are systemic. They are problems of corporate power. People at the COP, there were an awful lot of fossil fuel companies at the COP for some reason. There were a lot of politicians who owe a lot of their capital, literally in some cases, to the fossil fuel companies and so on. So the kind of control that some industries have, that's where the really big problems are. It is in political decision-making. Politicians have the power to change things really quite dramatically and are choosing not to. And that is not going to be changed by individuals recycling more plastic, using less plastic, and so on. So those things will help, that they're baby steps. But I really don't think that it is right to argue that, this is just because people don't recycle properly, because it's not. It's also because of the ways that governments invest or don't invest in recycling technologies or in green technologies. It's much, much bigger than individual choices. And there are also it can be a political device to tell the population that it's their fault and that they should be doing more, in order to deflect attention from the fact that politicians should be doing more, really. So I think that, and that is quite sinister, but is, I think, very much something that happens frequently. And it has to be solved through, ultimately it will be solved through changes in policies and changes in economic practice, rather than through individual choices and individual behaviours. And one of the things that we forget as well is that often the kinds of individual behaviours and the choices are a matter sometimes of having the sort of capital to be able to make those choices. Often vegan, vegetarian food is more expensive. You can buy frozen meat very cheaply. It's much easier if you're a family that's not earning very much money to buy frozen meat than it is to buy fresh vegetables every day. So there's a lot of problems that are just not things that individuals can do anything about. They're things that have to be solved with government subsidies and all of these kinds of things as well. There are so many different examples of that. And then there are individual things. So I drove here tonight. I don't need to drive here because I can cycle. But I don't cycle at weekends because I have inflammatory arthritis and I try to rest my joints so that I can function during the week. So that's my excuse, but at the same time, I have to be able to function during the week. All of us have to make these kinds of balances and imbalances in our lives based on the capacities that we have or don't have. And I'm not going to start judging disabled people for driving or elderly people who are in pain for driving or any of that kind of, those sorts of things I think are just unhelpful. There's no black and white in a lot of these things. And people who have very little money or have health issues or any other kinds of issues really face different kinds of problems. And that's not, government shouldn't be beating them up. When it's actually the problems are much, much bigger than individual choice. I
didn't warn you about this question. We're talking about bringing a Christian mind in these things. I'm wondering about how we bring, if you like, Christian prayers. I mean, when you pray about climate change, what does it look like?
I still find it quite, often very apologetic. Because of what we've done and are doing.
So you're bringing a sense of corporate human responsibility and guilt that you share in to God in that kind of forgive us, Lord way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because I think that's important.
Yeah.
And I suppose that also comes from the impacts that it's having on other people.
Yes.
Praying for wisdom, praying for humility among leaders, for good leaders, for good officials as well. And there are a lot of very good people working in government, not at the political level, but at the policy level, who just need to be in a position to actually be able to achieve things. And for that, you need politicians who will let them. And so praying for those kinds of things. Praying for greater equity between nations as well. And this was another big challenge at the COP, really. the whole process of the UNFCCC recognises that this problem was caused by the global north. There are they're called annex countries in the context of the treaty because they're listed in an annex. Those are the rich countries that caused climate change or initially did through their development. And they have a particular responsibility within the treaty to help the developing countries. And that there were a load of commitments made in 2009 for providing climate finance, which is to help those countries to develop in a way that is less destructive. But of course, none of the rich countries are meeting that. So, and because it's UN speak, it's all very vague how they're supposed to and whether they can do it through loans, which is actually just a punitive way of meeting it because they then charge interest, and so they're actually gaining money. But so the estimates of so they're supposed to provide 100 billion a year. The estimates of how much has been provided are sort of between 6 to 86 billion, depending on who you ask. And that's quite a wide range of uncertainty. So there's that kind of deep historical injustice as well, and how we tackle that.
Yes.
And that is also something that I feel quite strongly. Partly because I've worked in places like Montserrat, where there is an ongoing, and working in India, I work on projects in India on landslide risk and so on, and there is also a very violent colonial history in those countries that there is a very strong historical culpability around. Yes. And that's one of the most challenging things in the international policy landscape around climate change at the moment, is how to deal with that when the rich countries have all the power. But at the same time, countries like China and Russia, in not turning up to the COP, this was part of their point, was you're clearly not doing what you're supposed to do, and this process isn't working, so why turn up? And so I think when I pray about it, I'm quite conscious of a lot of those dynamics, spatial dynamics as well.
What does that mean?
Sort of so just the injustices between different countries and their experiences of climate change, and also of trying to develop in the context of climate change.
Thank you. That's an amazing answer for a question you hadn't even been prepped for. Thank you. And I think it's lovely to think that we can bring a Christian mind and also a Christian intercessory heart to the subject, and that may be a part of the way we as Christians make a difference. We're going to open it up for some questions now. If you feel confident, would like to ask a question from the floor, do put a hand up and we'll bring a mic to you so that everyone can hear. And if you're comfortable, if you could take your mask off to ask the question, that would probably mean it's less muffled. If you don't feel you'd like to do that, but you still like to ask a question, you can text me. I think, here we are. So I'll pick up your texts and then I'll send you the questions for you if you'd rather use me as a kind of ventriloquist dummy, which seems pretty appropriate, really. So, Graham, do you want to stand up? Yeah, let's go back to the back to Doug Reed at the back. Thanks, Doug.
Hi, Amy. I wondered if you could just say a few more words about the link between climate change and natural disasters.
Okay, yeah. So this is something that there's been a lot of research on in the last 10 years because the disasters community was sort of thinking that things were getting bigger, but we didn't have perfect data on it. So there was a special report, the SREX report in 2018, which was an IPCC report looking at extreme events. And then AR6, which is the recent report that's just been published. So it's currently actually in progress. The AR6 report, there's 3 parts to each IPCC report. There's the physical science basis, which is Working Group 1, and that's been published. We're still waiting for Working Group 2, which is, I can never remember the order of these words, but impact, adaptation, and vulnerability in some order. And then Working Group 3, which is mitigation, and those are going to be published in February, March next year. But the Working Group 1 report was very clear that there is now enough evidence to say that disasters like things like tropical cyclones, floods, heat waves, especially things like heat waves, all of those sorts of things are increasing in both frequency and particularly in intensity as a result of anthropogenic climate change. And they've done a lot of the maths around calculating the anthropogenic component of that, and they have pretty good confidence now that there is an increase in those kinds of events. And we're seeing it in the disasters kind of landscape as well, that there are more flooding events, more intense flooding events for longer time. There's flooding events in places where there really shouldn't be flooding events. So there are places where the climate is changing very rapidly. And one of the places I work is the Atacama Desert in Chile, because it has some epic volcanoes in it. Some of the pictures were also of that. And the Atacama is one of the driest places, or until recently was one of the driest places on Earth, but has taken to flooding in the spring. Well, in our spring, their autumn. Yeah, that causes mud flows, landslides, and things like that, which have been impacting some of the towns in Chile. And I mean, there's examples of this all over the world, but it's often worse in the countries that are least best equipped to deal with it as well. So, yeah, that evidence base is really getting quite firm now that extreme events are getting a lot worse. And heat waves and droughts and things like that have been really quite catastrophic in some parts of the world in recent years. There was a whole extra report on droughts recently, so it's sort of fresh in my mind.
I see a hand upstairs. Is that my friend Brother Jackson? Can you wait for the microphone, Brother Jackson? Do you mind getting up there? He's also texted me. This man never leaves me alone. Oh, he just says, I've got a question. Goodness, it's not. Good heavens. No, you wait for your mic, dear brother. Otherwise, the hard of hearing will not hear you, and I may not either. Okay, far away.
Amy, you've been blaming politicians for doing nothing. But if they tell us to replace our boilers with expensive heat pumps, aren't they going to get thrown out of office pronto?
I don't think that's the way that they would go about doing it. I think if you're going to... So they've had a few schemes like subsidising solar panels, installations and things like that. It has to be government subsidised. It has to take place slowly, and it has to be means tested to some extent, and so on. And there's a huge number of people in the university who would know a lot more about this than me, about policy incentives to help people to change their behaviours and so on. It can't just be down to individuals because people don't have the resources to do that. You can't just order people to change the way that they live and expect that they'll do it. You have to help them to do it. And you have to also just, be aware that it won't happen overnight either. These things don't. But things like, the government makes all this big fuss about how it has this solar panel scheme, but it's a tiny scheme. There's nothing like the resource that it needs. And there needs to be, the investment that is needed is astronomically bigger than the current investment in that kind of scheme. That's what the issues really are. So I don't think it would get them busted out, because I think if it's properly explained and properly subsidised and so on, then I think that kind of scheme would be popular, particularly with younger generations, I suspect, because there is a very strong effect of age on perceptions of climate risk as well.
Thank you. Now, we've got a question. This is a fish-related question. Could you describe the link, if any, between climate change and fishing and fish consumption?
Fishing and fish consumption?
It does say, if any.
The most obvious links with climate change are more around the ocean acidification process, so and the warming of the oceans, kind of obviously, that are changing the ability of marine ecosystems to function properly, and changing also where the fish go, I suppose, from a fisherman's perspective. But there have been massive coral bleaching events globally over the last few years, and that is horrible from a God created this thing, and it's beautiful and wonderful and shows how amazing he is point of view, but it's also catastrophic for people whose livelihoods depend on fishing on the reefs, because the ecosystem needs the reefs. So if all the reefs die, then we are in lots of problems. And this is one of the kind of things around climate change that I think is really important, that it is linked into everything else. So we have this, I often think about it as sort of environmental degradation, there's climate change, but there's also biodiversity loss, which is hugely affected by climate change, as well as by other human issues like deforestation and things like that. But all of these things feed into each other. There are problems of mining. Another thing that happens in the Atacama Desert is lithium mining. Lithium is used in batteries. It's very, very valuable. But it also drains all the water out of the desert and kills the ecosystem there. And so even when we're trying to produce green technologies through lithium batteries, we are running into lots of problems with the ecosystem. We have a lot of things to balance in trying to manage this. It's a really complicated problem. It's not something that's just one thing. It's got lots and lots of bits to it. And the marine impacts of climate change are pretty catastrophic. So,
Okay, I think we'll call halt on fish because questions coming in by text thick and fast.
Oh, good.
Is there a specific verse or biblical passage that has compelled you as a Christian to pursue social justice and specifically the climate change research? Do you feel a kind of energy from any particular text that's done that?
I think there's quite a number of bits in Matthew where Jesus is talking about looking after other people. But I think often with research, the verse that I keep coming back to is the one about being renewed by the transformation of your mind, be transformed by the renewal of your mind kind of things as well, so that you're using your mind in a way that is sort of transformational. I suppose it's funny because transformation is a technical term in some of the areas of research that I use around trying to transform society so that they function better, essentially. So for me, that sort of links in. But I do feel, and I think also the kinds of, some of the stuff in the Old Testament around looking after the people in the community that are least able to cope. Even the bits in Leviticus about looking after the foreigner among you and all of that, the sort of leaving the bits of the harvest for people to eat, all of those sorts of things. I think the general kind of attitude that comes out of those passages, and which Jesus then kind of fulfills in lots of ways when he talks about loving your neighbour as yourself. And yeah, things like Parable of the Good Samaritan, even, all of these things are really important in sort of our attitude towards other people, often cross-culturally, I think.
Now, I've had a message which says it's Dorothy. There's only one Dorothy, I think. Where are you, Dorothy? Here we are. Do you want to get the mic to Dorothy? Far away when you get it.
Thank you very much. I just had a question in regards to what you were saying about the role of individual choice and responsibility.
Yeah.
So, part of the thinking behind it is the idea of could individual responsibility and choice still be important, even with it being important what politicians do, the fact that we ourselves can have a role in communicating with them, given that they are also humans, and even not that powerful politicians can actually have an impact. So that kind of role of individual choice and responsibility. But also the importance of individual responsibility when it comes to as Christians, the holiness of our actions, or the purity of our thoughts. So I was just wondering, especially thinking about feeling potentially overwhelmed if we are people that don't, for example, have a balancing exercise in our head where we have reasons to not make those good choices for the environment. I was just wondering, so not the government beating us up about it, but us beating ourselves up. How important is still individual choice and responsibility in terms of being holy in our thoughts and our intentions and our actions, but also how do you balance that with not being overwhelmed and just burdened by the weight of trying to make those good decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's is a challenge in the same way that often the reasons that we do things are manifold, and I think some of it does come down to motivation. It's have you actually got a good... Is your motive actually just that you don't want to because you're being lazy, or is there actually a reason? And sometimes that means being really, really honest with yourself. I think you're absolutely right also that individual choices around politics and things like that is an element of individual choice. It's also an area where we can be quite effective as a body, working together with NGOs, for example, Christian NGOs like Tear Fund. I think that getting involved with them, or at least just following them and being informed about what they're doing and giving to them and so on, praying for them, So those are individual choices. The thing is, I think we can all beat ourselves up about sin a lot, and we all do, and it's kind of right in one sense, but it's also not right because Jesus died for our sins. And so getting constantly bogged down, I think these kinds of, when it is a sin, it's like any of those other sins, that you take it to God and you are forgiven for it, and you should not get overburdened by those kinds of sins any more than any other kind of sin, I think. And I know that is hard to do, and often it's hard to know what your motive is because you're tired, so you don't want to do this thing because you're tired, but you can also see a logic in not doing it, or, that there's a lot of, or you're saving money by buying this thing rather than that thing, and that's a good thing to do in some circumstances, and especially, if you're a student and you don't have much money, for example. So again, you shouldn't be beating yourself up. I don't think. I think it's really unhelpful to get into those sorts of. I think it's more useful to see it as a positive thing to be doing than beat yourself up for not doing it, if you see what I mean.
That's great. That covers a number of other folks' questions about the sense of being overwhelmed. And someone was asking if there was one thing to campaign about, because you can't campaign about everything, what would you campaign about?
That's a hard question. Okay. I think from my perspective, the kind of inequalities between the global north and the global south, and the way that global north policies just kind of keep the south poor. But I do think that God gives us individual interests and individual gifts. And I think you should go for the thing that relates to your individual interests and your individual gifts. So for me, that might be around sort of disaster risk or inequality in resource and so on. But for somebody else, it might be getting involved with preserving a marine area, or, there's so many things that you could get involved with or campaign for. I wouldn't stick to one that you think is more holy than another, because I don't think it works like that. I think God gives us our own particular interests and gifts for a reason.
But perhaps for someone to throw themselves at one or two, so they're focusing.
Yeah. I think that's a good, because you can, you could just spend the whole day on the internet otherwise.
A couple of that I think cluster together. How do you balance a sense of urgency to act on climate change with the hope we have of a new creation? And the other one was about whether we see any biblical justification for thinking God may limit the negative effects of human behaviour on the climate. They sort of fit together a bit, don't they?
So I think with the first one, yes, we have a hope of a new creation, and that's one of the things that can keep us away from despair, because to be perfectly honest, I think this is an area where there is a lot of despair in the secular world, quite rightly. And I think Christians can have a distinctive position within that. But I also think that the kind of the biblical emphasis, particularly in the Psalms, but also in Job and other places, around how important creation is to God, and the ways that we are marring it and destroying it, and all of those kinds of things. I think that, you can balance it in the sense of not despairing, but I think feeling a deep sense of just corporate guilt, I think, is right. So I think I would see it, and I think that there is within that a motivation to act and to do the very best we can, because that's what the New Testament tells us to do. It says, yes, it's coming to an end, but you should still live like Christ. Yeah. And you should be trying to become more like Christ, who created all of these things and made them good. So that's how we should be focusing on it, I think.
wonder if you know that story of, someone asked Martin Luther what he would do if he knew the world was going to end tomorrow, and he said he'd plant a tree today.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, do you see what he's saying? It's very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of saying, well, I've got my responsibilities for this life now, and there is a significance in what I do in this life doing a positive thing like planting a tree, or perhaps doing something to prevent trees being destroyed.
Yeah.
And God will recognize that in the new creation.
Yeah.
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 Okay, question about protesters or protests. You said they were encouraging, but how helpful are they for actual change, influence on politicians and policy, and
Well,
do they make a difference?
I tend to look historically at that, partly because I come from Girton, which was the first women's college and associated with the suffragette movement and so on. A number of the founders were linked to that, which of course was a successful movement. There are a lot of historical examples of protest movements that have been successful in affecting change. And it doesn't happen instantly, but it happens over years. And I do think that is really significant. Yeah. And I think we have to look back to historical movements like the suffrage movement, but there are plenty of other examples all over the world where protests have been really significant in changing policy. Might not even be with the current government. Let's not go into that. But
No, you're not going to.
Short leash as far as that's concerned. But the kind of government in waiting for the next government will see what goes on and will learn from it. So I think protests can be very effective, even if they often feel like they're not, and get very frustrated often.
Going to move on. This is a good and different angle. What do you think about climate change reversal technologies like carbon scrubbing and multi-planetary efforts like colonising Mars? Okay, we know what you think about colonising Mars, but what about the carbon scrubbing?
I think this is another area where there's a balance, because there are some technologies that we know work, and at the moment we do not have the capacity to do them at the scale that we need. I don't think we can be dependent on technologies to solve these problems. I also would be cautionary about depending on them. I think it's very easy politically to say, but we're so clever, we can do all these amazing things. And one of the things that gets proposed regularly is pretending to be a volcano and injecting stratospheric aerosols so that you reduce insulation. We know that happens after a volcanic eruption because we've seen it happen. What we don't know is much about a lot of the kind of spatial effects of that, precipitation effects of it. Also the fact that, you could do it in Sweden, but it would affect the whole world. So who has the right to make a decision to do that anyway? And we have a very long history of checkered record with new technologies. New technologies frequently have unanticipated side effects. And so if you're talking about really large-scale geoengineering projects, I think that's really, really ethically dubious, because we just do not know what the impact will be. We do not have adequate atmospheric models to know what the impact of stratospheric aerosol injection would be in the ways that we plan to do it or think about doing it. There's various scoping projects underway to try and see if we could, and it's slightly terrifying, because we do have this long history of just generating more problems by coming up with new technologies rather than actually solving them. So that's one thing. I think there are smaller scale technologies. There are things like renewable energy technologies which are improving and so on. Sometimes do have problems around using sort of rare earth metals and things like that then produce mining problems and other kinds of issues and social issues as well as environmental ones. But I think ultimately that you cannot get away from the need to dramatically reduce greenhouse emissions. That is the fundamental. You have to do both, but we really, really cannot be dependent on some shiny new technology. I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but anyway.
Yeah, watch it.
The kind of new technology will solve the Irish border problem in Brexit. Didn't, though, did it?
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. We do a confession and absolution session for all your extreme political comments afterwards. She's speaking in a personal capacity. Okay.
Yeah.
We're a mixed audience this evening, but an awful lot of the masked faces we see in front of us are a lot younger than me and dare I say it, than you as well. What do you say to an 18, 19-year-old who is a Christian and just sort of sees, I want to make a difference here, and I'd like to be able to do that vocationally in terms of my engineering, my physics, my involvement in social science research or geography or whatever it may be. What would you say to that person?
I think, again, this is something I've said earlier, really, that God gives us all different skills and abilities and interests. And so I think I would follow those down a route that seems to be productive for you. And sometimes that might be going and teaching in a school and inspiring school kids to do things. There are lots and lots of different ways of making a difference. It doesn't have to be that you're going to solve the problem by coming up with some new technology that somehow miraculously is perfect. There's ways that we can beat ourselves up. I spent a lot of years agonizing over vocation, so I can kind of empathize quite a lot with those. I still remember what that felt like. And I absolutely 100% would not have predicted where I ended up in any way. So I think also having faith that God will take you to where he wants you to go, and not sort of agonizing to the point that it makes you ill, because that's not productive. And he has given you gifts. He will open the doors if you push on them. So just keep pushing on them.
And would you not say that, in the light of what you described, there is a need for Christians with active minds and intellectual curiosity and a sense of social conscience about these things to be involved? And I could have mentioned whole public policy areas as well, which is different in addition to the more technical science stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we need young Christians to be thinking, I want to go in there and I do want to make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's really important as well. I think if you have a very strong, I need to make a difference, that also comes from God. So there are ways of trying to find out more through, there's lots and lots of opportunities to think, if you're in HSPS or geography, or to sort of talk to the lecturers, talk to people who come and give talks, because there's loads of amazing people who come and give talks in Cambridge. Look at the talks.cam website, look at what's going on in your faculty, and try and meet the people who come and speak. Look at the Centre for Science and Policy. They have some great events as well. And try to identify a few key people that you could talk to. Pray about it, obviously. And maybe, talk to some of the Christians in the church who know students who've moved on now and gone into policy or other areas, and can put you in touch with some of those people maybe to talk it through. Because there's lots of opportunities to discuss things with people who've been through the same kind of process. You just have to sort of know where to look for them, really, I think.
Yeah. Amy, thank you so much. We're really very grateful indeed. I'm going to pray in a moment, but I think we should express our appreciation. We just pray. We thank you, Heavenly Father, for the evening that we've had and all that we've heard. We commit to you in particular this grave matter of climate change and the effects that it's having. And we pray, Lord, have mercy. We pray for Amy and her work. We pray you call others to work specifically in this area, engineers, materials scientists, physicists, geographers, people involved in social science and public policy. Perhaps you'll even call, Lord, from this group some who will be involved as elected politicians. And for all of us, Lord, as we do our bit. We pray for Amy specifically and ask a blessing on her in her work. In Jesus' name, amen. Amy's 2 Cambridge papers, really worth reading, copies at the back. You can also sign up to become a subscriber, I think, to Cambridge Papers, which is a brilliant Cambridge-based thing that tries to bring a Christian mind on all sorts of things, not just geography. If anyone wants to think through the Christian mind thing a bit more, forgive the plug, but there's some stuff in it in a book that someone connected with Eden wrote called Maximum Life, and there's copies on the bookstall. And it was done by a complete amateur, but it kind of sets out a very basic introductory framework that the experts kind of go through and go on to greater things. I didn't get to all the questions. If you would like to ask one of Amy personally, you can come up and do that. Debbie's waving a coffee pot at me, which I think is not a way of saying she wants to bang me on the head, but to say that there's refreshments out there. And in a little bit, we're going to need to clear this area for the student Christmas party, so there'll be an announcement about that, but the refreshments will be happening there in the meantime. Thank you all very much. God bless.